I was the only one who took care of my grandparents. Now my family wants a cut of their inheritance. The lawyer barely finished reading the will before the shouting began. The conference room, once silent in anticipation, now erupted into chaos. A cacophony of outrage, disbelief, and self-righteous fury spilled from the lips of people who had never so much as lifted a finger to help the very people they now claimed to love. "This is ridiculous!" my Aunt Carol shrieked, her voice pitched high with incredulity. "There's no way this is right. Mom and Dad would never do this." Her husband, a man who had always carried the smug entitlement of someone who had never known struggle, slammed his fist onto the polished mahogany table. "This has to be some kind of mistake. I mean, come on, everything? To one person?" The person in question was me. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, fingers folded in my lap, heart pounding steadily as their rage swelled around me. I had known this moment was coming. I had anticipated the fury, the accusations, the sheer, unrelenting entitlement that my so-called family would unleash upon realizing they were left with nothing. And yet, knowing hadn't lessened the impact of watching their faces twist with greed and anger. "What the hell did you say to them?" my cousin Daniel snapped, his face red, his body leaning forward as if he might lunge across the table. "Did you brainwash them? Trick them into thinking you were their only family?" I lifted my eyes to meet his, steady and unblinking. "I didn't have to." The room went silent for a moment. A heavy pause filled with simmering resentment and the weight of unspoken truths. Because they knew. Deep down, beneath the layers of greed and arrogance, they all knew. They knew that while they lived their lives without a second thought, while they took vacations and spent weekends ignoring the calls they couldn't be bothered to answer, I was the one who had been there. I was the one who had sat beside my grandmother's hospital bed, holding her frail hand while she fought through another endless night of pain. I was the one who had driven my grandfather to every doctor's appointment, making sure he had his medications, his groceries, his dignity. I was the one who answered the phone at 2 a.m., who showed up when no one else did, who gave years of my life to making sure they were never alone. And now, the will reflected exactly what they had chosen to ignore, the undeniable truth that I had been the only one who truly cared. But they weren't interested in truth. They were interested in money. "This isn't fair," my Uncle Robert muttered, shaking his head as if trying to dispel reality itself. "They should have divided it equally. We're their children. They should have..." "They should have what?" I interrupted, my voice cutting clean through the rising tide of indignation. "Given you something you didn't earn? Rewarded you for neglecting them? Pretended you deserved a single cent when you spent years treating them like an afterthought?" Robert's mouth snapped shut, his face darkening with barely restrained fury. Aunt Carol wasn't as quiet. She turned on me, her eyes blazing with self-righteous fury. "They were our parents. We had lives, we had responsibilities. We couldn't just drop everything the way you did." I let out a slow, humorless laugh. "Right. You had lives. You had things that were more important than them. But now that they're gone, now that there's money involved, suddenly they matter to you." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Tell me something, Aunt Carol. When was the last time you called them? Not out of obligation, not because someone forced you to, but because you wanted to." Her mouth opened, then shut. I turned my gaze to Daniel. "How many times did you even visit? Once a year? Twice, maybe? Did you even know what Grandpa's favorite meal was? What book Grandma reread every winter?" I shook my head, disgust curling in my gut. "No, of course you didn't, because they weren't people to you. They were just a safety net, a backup plan, something you assumed would always be there no matter how much you ignored them." A tense silence stretched between us. Then finally my father spoke. His voice was quieter than the others, but no less dangerous. "You think you're better than us?" I turned to him slowly, feeling a familiar, long-buried anger coil in my chest. My father had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with the expectation of obedience. He was the type who never apologized, who never admitted fault, who believed his presence alone was enough to justify respect he had never earned. I met his gaze head-on. "No," I said, voice even. "I think I did what none of you were willing to do. And they saw that. His jaw tightened. I could see it now. The cracks in his pride, the bruised ego of a man who had convinced himself he would always have the final say. Not this time. This time the final say had already been written in ink, and it was mine. The meeting ended in cold silence. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman who had clearly seen this kind of mess before, merely handed me a copy of the will and nodded in approval. "You're within your rights to keep everything as is," she said quietly, as the rest of my family stormed out, muttering bitter threats and empty promises to fight the decision. They made their wishes clear. I nodded. I know. And I did. Because my grandparents had told me. They had known what would happen. They had seen the way their own children had abandoned them. The way their grandchildren only reached out when it was convenient. And they had made a choice, not out of spite, not out of manipulation, but out of justice. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, inhaling deeply as the weight of the past settled around me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A new message. "Dad, you'll regret this." I stared at the words, a slow realization settling in my chest. I didn't. I had spent years giving, sacrificing, putting myself last for the sake of people who had never valued me. And now I had finally been given something in return. Not just money, not just property, but proof. Proof that I had mattered. Proof that my love, my care, my presence had meant something. I looked at my father's message one last time, then deleted it without responding. Because I had nothing left to say. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was war. It had barely been a week since the will was read, and already my so-called family was circling like vultures. Calls came at all hours, some dripping with feigned politeness, others laced with unfiltered venom. Every text, every email, every sudden, heartfelt attempt at reconnecting was just another desperate attempt to stake their claim on something they had never earned. But the worst part? I wasn't surprised. I had spent years watching them treat my grandparents like burdens, inconveniences to be dealt with only when it benefited them. And now that those same grandparents had left everything to me, the same people who couldn't be bothered to show up were suddenly acting like they had been loving, devoted family members all along. I sat in my apartment, phone buzzing relentlessly beside me, the same 4 names flashing on the screen in rotation: Aunt Carol, Uncle Robert, my cousin Daniel, and my father. I ignored them all. Instead, I leaned back, staring up at the ceiling, letting the weight of everything settle over me. The money, the house, the accounts, the investments, everything my grandparents had built, everything they had left behind, was now mine. It was supposed to feel like a victory, a validation of all the years I had given, all the sacrifices I had made to be there for them. But it didn't feel like a win. It felt like standing at the edge of a battlefield, waiting for the next attack. And it didn't take long for it to arrive. The first real move came from my father. I should have expected it. He had always been the one to act first, the one who believed that intimidation was just another form of persuasion. I found out about it through my lawyer, an email sent to the firm riddled with accusations. My son manipulated my parents in their final years. He took advantage of their declining health and mental state, coercing them into changing the will. We demand a full investigation into this matter, and we will pursue legal action to ensure the rightful heirs receive what is owed to them. Rightful heirs. I stared at the words, something sharp and bitter twisting in my chest. He had the audacity to call himself that. A man who had barely visited his own parents in the last 5 years of their lives. A man who had ignored their calls, dismissed their struggles, and only showed up when there was something to be gained. And now, when the money wasn't his, when the power had shifted, he was trying to rewrite history. I clenched my jaw, forcing my breath to stay even. It was a strategy, nothing more. A desperate attempt to cast doubt, to create just enough suspicion that I might cave and offer them something to make it go away. But they didn't know me as well as they thought, because I wasn't caving. I met with my lawyer that afternoon, sitting across from her in her sleek office as she scanned the email, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This is baseless," she said, shaking her head. "There's no proof of coercion, no sign of mental incapacity in your grandparents' medical records. They made their wishes very clear, and the will is solid." She glanced at me over her glasses. They're bluffing. I exhaled slowly. So what happens now? She leaned back, fingers tapping against the desk. We could ignore it, let them burn themselves out, or... She tilted her head. We could send a very clear message that this won't end in their favor. I considered that. Considered them. If I ignored it, they wouldn't stop. Not until they had drained me of time, patience, and maybe even money. They didn't care about winning. They cared about making me fight. But if I shut it down now, if I made it clear that they had already lost, I straightened. Send the message. She smiled. Good choice. The response was swift and brutal. A formal letter, drafted and sent with legal precision, outlining in detail the absurdity of their claims. My grandparents' medical records were attached, proving they had been of sound mind when they signed the will. Witness testimonies were included. Nurses, doctors, even close family friends who had seen firsthand that my grandparents had made this decision without a single ounce of pressure from me. The message was clear. You have no case. You have no leverage. Walk away before this gets worse. But of course, they didn't. Instead, they escalated. The next attack came from Aunt Carol, and this time, she played a different game. She didn't send a threat. She sent an invitation, a dinner, at her house, to talk things over like family. I almost laughed when I saw the message. Like family. As if she hadn't spent the last week calling me a liar, a manipulator, a thief. As if she hadn't spent years ignoring my grandparents, pretending they didn't exist until their money was suddenly up for grabs. Still, I went. Not because I expected a genuine discussion, but because I wanted to see just how far they were willing to go. When I arrived, the house was exactly as I remembered. Grand, elegant, meticulously curated to showcase wealth that was more about appearance than reality. The dining room was set with expensive china, the table filled with carefully chosen dishes meant to create an atmosphere of warmth and unity. It was all an illusion. Aunt Carol greeted me with a forced smile, her eyes scanning me like she was looking for a weakness to exploit. "I'm so glad you came," she said, voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I didn't respond. The others were already seated, my father, Uncle Robert, Daniel, each of them watching me, waiting. I took a seat, but I didn't touch the food. Carol folded her hands together, exhaling dramatically. "Look," she began, "this whole situation has gotten out of hand. There's no need for lawyers, no need for fighting. We're family, and family should share." I tilted my head, letting her words hang in the air. "Share?" She smiled as if I were a child who didn't understand simple math. "You got everything. We just think it's fair that we all get a portion." I leaned back, resting an arm on the chair. "Fair?" "Yes," she said quickly. "It's not right for one person to take everything." I let out a slow breath, nodding. "You're absolutely right." Her face lit up with hope. Then I smiled. "And that's exactly why my grandparents didn't leave you anything." The room went silent. The hope in her eyes turned to fury, her lips pressing into a thin, angry line. My father let out a slow breath, his fists clenching. Daniel was the first to break. "You smug little..." I cut him off. "Let me make one thing clear," I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to slice through the tension. "I'm not giving you anything. Not a cent. Not a single piece of what they left me. And if you think you can intimidate or guilt me into changing my mind, you've already lost." Carol slammed a hand onto the table. "You ungrateful brat." I stood. "I think we're done here," I said, adjusting my jacket. "If you want to keep fighting, I have plenty of time to waste watching you lose." I met my father's gaze one last time. "But you all should ask yourselves one thing." They stared. I smiled, slow and cold. "If you really deserved a share, why didn't they leave you one?" Silence. I turned and walked out, leaving them to choke on the answer. The threats didn't stop. Even after I walked out of Aunt Carol's house, even after I made it abundantly clear that I owed them nothing, they kept trying. It was almost pathetic, the way they cycled through different tactics, desperately grasping for any way to break me down. First, it was legal threats, hollow and meaningless, their attempts to challenge the will crumbling the moment my lawyer shut them down. Then came the emotional blackmail, messages dripping with saccharine regret, suddenly remembering that we were family, and that my grandparents, would have wanted us to stay together. When neither of those worked, they turned to manipulation, spreading lies to mutual acquaintances, painting me as a greedy, deceitful opportunist who had somehow tricked my dying grandparents into leaving me everything. But no matter what they tried, the truth remained. They had lost, and I had won. The final straw came 2 months later in the form of an unexpected visitor. I was at my grandparents' house, the house that was now mine, sorting through their things, carefully deciding what to keep and what to donate. The air still carried the faint scent of my grandmother's favorite lavender perfume, the walls lined with photos of memories my family had long since abandoned. I was halfway through boxing up my grandfather's books when the doorbell rang. I knew before I even opened it, knew from the weight in my chest, the way the house itself seemed to hold its breath. My father stood on the front porch, hands shoved into his pockets, his face as unreadable as ever. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "What do you want?" He exhaled, gaze shifting to the house behind me, his expression darkening with something unreadable. "We need to talk." I didn't move. "There's nothing left to say." He ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly tired. "Just 5 minutes?" For a long moment I debated slamming the door in his face, but something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe a final need for closure, made me step aside. He walked in, slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning the home he had barely set foot in for years. "It looks the same," he muttered. I stayed silent, waiting. He turned to face me. "You really won't share?" My chest tightened with frustration. "Are you serious?" "I'm asking for fairness." His voice was calm, measured, the same tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable, when he wanted to convince people he was right. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Fairness? You ignored them for years. You didn't visit. You didn't help. You didn't care. And now you want to talk about fairness?" His jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. "They were my parents. They were my family," I shot back. "Not just by blood, but by choice. I was there for them. I took care of them. I loved them. You just assumed they'd always be there until suddenly, they weren't." His silence was answer enough. He knew that he had no real argument, no justification, no claim to anything, but pride was a dangerous thing, and my father was a prideful man. "I never thought it would end up like this," he admitted, his voice quieter. I thought there would always be time." Something flickered in his eyes, not anger, not entitlement, but something closer to regret. And maybe once upon a time I would have cared. But regret wasn't love. Regret wasn't showing up when it mattered. Regret was useless. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. "It's too late." His eyes met mine, searching. "So that's it? You're just cutting us off?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." He swallowed, the weight of my words settling between us. And then, finally, he nodded. "Then I guess this really is goodbye." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because it was goodbye. For good. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The calls slowed. The messages stopped. One by one, my so-called family realized the truth they had refused to accept. I was done. I moved forward. I finished going through my grandparents' things, keeping the pieces of them that mattered, letting go of the rest. I sold the house. Not because I didn't love it, but because I knew it was time to let it go, to step into the future they had wanted for me. And in the end, I made a decision, not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but out of justice. I took a portion of the inheritance, the part I knew my grandparents would have wanted to be used for something good, and donated it to a foundation in their name, a cause they had always cared about, something that would carry their legacy in a way my family never could. And as for the rest, I kept it. Not because I was greedy, not because I was bitter, but because I had earned it. One evening, as the sun set in golden streaks across the sky, I sat in my new home, one I had chosen for myself, built with my own decisions, no longer weighed down by the past, and I felt something I had never felt before: peace. Not the fragile, temporary kind, but the real and unshakable one. I was the only one who helped my uncle. When he was sick, now my family is furious, He left me his fortune. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick with barely restrained fury, and the kind of silence that was louder than any screaming match. The polished mahogany table in the center of the law office stretched between us like an invisible battlefield, the air electric with unspoken accusations and unbridled greed. My mother sat at one end, her spine rigid, her manicured fingers clutching a silk handkerchief that she had yet to use. Beside her, my aunt, her sister, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, lips pressed together in a tight line, as if holding back the venom she so clearly wanted to spit. My cousin, Matthew, the self-proclaimed successful one of the family, sat with his arms crossed over his chest, impatience written all over his smug, entitled face. They were all waiting for the moment they could revel in what they had convinced themselves was theirs by right. But I already knew what was coming. The lawyer, an older gentleman with silver-rimmed glasses and a face carved with experience, cleared his throat. He had barely begun reading the will, yet I could already see the storm forming in their eyes, feel the simmering rage beginning to bubble beneath the surface of their carefully controlled exteriors. And then it happened. The moment that shattered their illusions. And to my beloved nephew, who stood by me when no one else did, who gave me his time, his kindness, and his unwavering loyalty, I leave everything. The house, the estate, the savings, the stocks, the business, all of it. Silence. It stretched for a beat, maybe two, as the words settled in, sinking into their greedy little minds. Then, like a dam breaking, the room erupted. "What?" My mother's voice cracked, a mixture of disbelief and fury lacing every syllable. She clutched the arm of her chair as if the sheer force of her outrage might send her toppling over. "This has to be some kind of mistake," my aunt snapped, leaning forward so aggressively that the lawyer had to lean back in his chair. Her perfectly curled hair trembled with the force of her indignation. Matthew let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, no way. There is no way Uncle Richard would do that. No way." The lawyer merely adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "I assure you there is no mistake." He lifted the pages of the will, flipping through them with practiced efficiency. "Your uncle's wishes were clear. His estate, his wealth, his assets, they all go to—" He glanced at me, giving a slight nod. "His only loyal family member." Their heads snapped toward me in unison, and I held all the power. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, letting them stew in their disbelief. I had earned this moment. Every appointment I had taken my uncle to, every night I had stayed up by his bedside, every errand I had run when he was too weak to move, I had earned this, but they couldn't see that. They never would. "This is insane," my mother hissed, her carefully curated facade of composure slipping further with each passing second. "I'm his sister. He wouldn't just cut me out like that." Apparently he did. My voice was calm, even, controlled, but beneath it there was something else, something cold, something unyielding. Bullshit. Matthew's hand slammed against the table, rattling the crystal water glasses that had been placed before us. His blue eyes, so much like my uncle's, burned with resentment. "You manipulated him." I let out a low, quiet chuckle. "Oh, really?" I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "Tell me, Matthew, when was the last time you even saw Uncle Richard?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. I turned my gaze to my mother. "And you?" She stiffened, her eyes darting away. I shifted my attention to my aunt. "How about you, Aunt Julia? When was the last time you so much as called him? Sent him a birthday card? Asked if he needed anything?" Her face paled, her throat working as if she were struggling to find an excuse. I leaned forward now, my voice low, measured. "Because I was there, every single day, when he was too sick to get out of bed, when the pain was so unbearable that he could barely speak, when the doctors told him there was nothing else they could do." My fingers curled around the armrest of my chair, my voice steady, but sharp. "I was there. None of you were." The truth hung in the air like a blade, sharp and inescapable. But they weren't ready to surrender just yet. "He was dying," my mother snapped, her eyes wild with desperation. "He wasn't in his right mind. You must have, I don't know, tricked him into signing everything over to you." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Your brother was of sound mind when he made these arrangements. His gaze swept across the table, his tone edged with finality. This will is legally binding. This will is legally binding. His decision was made of his own free will. My aunt scoffed, crossing her arms. Then why? Why would he do this? I inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the answer pressing against my ribs. Because he saw what they really were. Because he had spent his last years watching them live their lives without sparing him a second thought. Because he knew, better than anyone, what it felt like to be abandoned by the very people who were supposed to love him. I could have said all of that. But instead, I simply met my mother's furious gaze and said, because I was the only one who cared. Her face twisted, but she had no retort, no argument, because she knew it was true. My cousin shook his head, his jaw tightening. This isn't over, he muttered, pushing back his chair. No, I agreed, watching as he stood, his hands clenched into fists. It's just finally fair. One by one they left, angry, defeated, empty-handed. For 3 days the phone calls didn't stop. Every time my phone buzzed, it was another name I recognized, another voice I had spent years of my life knowing, yet never truly feeling connected to. First, my mother, then my aunt, then Matthew. Their numbers flashed across my screen like a constant, relentless reminder that they weren't done with me. Not yet. At first, I let them go to voicemail. I had no desire to listen to the self-righteous fury they had bottled up since the reading of the will. But when the messages started filling up with thinly veiled threats, guilt-tripping monologues, and the occasional venom-laced insult, I started picking up, just to hear the desperation in their voices. You think this is over? Matthew's voice, sharp and bitter, had crackled through the speaker late last night, his words carrying the unmistakable edge of barely controlled rage. You think you can just walk away with everything and we'll let you? Let me. As if I needed their permission. I leaned back in the grand leather chair of my uncle's study, letting my fingers skim over the polished surface of his antique desk. The house, the estate, had officially been transferred into my name yesterday. The paperwork was signed, the assets secured, the bank accounts now under my control. And my family knew it. That was why the wolves were circling. I glanced out the window, watching as the autumn wind stirred the golden leaves in the vast courtyard. The estate was enormous, far too large for one person, yet somehow, it felt right that it had been left to me. My uncle's presence still lingered in every room, in the scent of old books, in the echo of footsteps down the long marble hallways. He had chosen me, and they hated that. A sharp knock at the front door pulled me from my thoughts. I exhaled slowly, setting my phone down, already knowing who it would be. They had been calling. Now, they were here. I took my time making my way to the grand entryway, my footsteps steady against the polished floors. When I pulled open the heavy wooden door, I wasn't surprised to find my mother standing there, flanked by my aunt and Matthew, the uninvited guests. She didn't bother with pleasantries. You're being cruel. I studied her carefully. My mother had always been a woman of poise, a master of appearing in control, even when her world was crumbling. But right now, beneath the anger, beneath the carefully maintained elegance, I saw something she would never admit to. Fear. I'm being fair, I corrected, my voice smooth. Something none of you ever were to him. Aunt Julia let out a sharp scoff, crossing her arms. Oh, please. He was our family, too. You think just because you spent a few months playing nurse, you're entitled to everything? My gaze darkened. A few months? I stepped forward, my tone colder now. I was there for years. I was the one who held his hand when the doctors gave him the diagnosis. I was the one who drove him to his treatments. I was the one who made sure he wasn't alone when the pain got so bad that he could barely speak. I let the words sink in, watching as they shifted uncomfortably. And where were you? I asked, tilting my head. Oh, that's right. Too busy. Too important to care. My mother's jaw tightened. That's not fair. I arched a brow. Isn't it? Matthew let out a dry, humorless laugh, stepping past them and into the house without waiting for an invitation. He turned in a slow circle, taking in the grand chandeliers, the expensive furniture, the vastness of the estate. You're not keeping all of this, he said, voice low. You know that, right? I leaned against the doorframe, watching him with an amused expression. "Oh? And what exactly do you think is going to happen, Matthew? You think you're going to take it from me?" His eyes met mine, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker there. Resentment, jealousy, maybe even regret. "Uncle Richard wouldn't have wanted this," he muttered, shaking his head. My patience snapped. "Are you serious?" I stepped closer, my voice sharp enough to cut. "You didn't know what he wanted because you never bothered to ask. You never bothered to be there." My aunt inhaled sharply, as if physically recoiling from my words. My mother tried again, softer this time. "Please, sweetheart, we're still family." I let out a slow breath, my hands clenching at my sides. Family. The word felt hollow coming from her, empty of any real meaning. "Funny," I murmured, "because when he was sick and needed you, that wasn't enough of a reason for you to show up. But now that there's money involved?" My gaze swept over them, filled with quiet disdain. Now, suddenly, we're family again? None of them spoke. They had no defense, no excuse that could justify their absence, their negligence. Because they knew the truth just as well as I did. My uncle had left everything to me because I was the only one who deserved it. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair before stepping aside. "You should go." Matthew scoffed. "This isn't over." I smirked. "For you, it is." And then, without another word, I shut the door in their faces. I leaned against the cool wood for a moment, letting the silence settle over me. They would come back. I wasn't naive enough to think that a single confrontation would end this. They would fight. They would scheme. They would try to twist the narrative to make themselves the victims. But none of it mattered, because the power had shifted. For the next 2 weeks, the vultures circled. My family, who had once ignored me as easily as they had ignored my uncle in his final years, now seemed to believe they had the right to invade my life. The phone calls continued, the emails poured in, and when I stopped answering, they resorted to showing up at the estate, pounding on the grand wooden doors as if sheer persistence would be enough to break me. But I didn't break. I let them stew in their resentment, let them seethe in their own greed, because I had earned this silence. I had spent years listening to their indifference, years standing alone while they thrived in their self-absorbed little worlds. And now, when they wanted something from me, I wanted nothing from them. Then the threats began. At first they were subtle, thinly veiled warnings about how unfair the will was, how certain people in the family might decide to contest it, how maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't be able to handle the stress of it all and should consider being reasonable by splitting the inheritance. I laughed at those. Then the subtlety disappeared. A letter arrived, no return address, just a crisp white envelope slipped under the massive iron gates of the estate. I opened it in the study, my uncle's leather chair creaking softly beneath me as I read the words scrawled in jagged handwriting. "You don't deserve any of it. You think you won, but you didn't. We'll take what's ours, one way or another." I set the letter down, exhaling slowly. I wasn't afraid. I was furious. They had abandoned my uncle, tossed him aside like he was nothing, and now they had the audacity to act as though they had been wronged? As if I was the villain in this story? No. They were done taking things from me. This time, I was going to end it. I invited them to the estate. Not because I wanted to make peace. Not because I wanted to negotiate. Because I wanted them to see, one last time, that they had lost. When they arrived, their faces were masks of false civility, but their eyes burned with frustration, with barely contained fury. My mother was the first to step through the towering doors, her lips curled into something that was supposed to be a smile but failed miserably. My aunt followed, arms crossed tightly, her expression taut with disapproval. Matthew came last, his gaze scanning the lavish entryway, nostrils flaring as he took in the wealth that wasn't his. I led them into the grand sitting room, the very one where I had sat with my uncle countless times, listening to his stories, drinking expensive coffee as he told me things I now realized he had never shared with anyone else in the family. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then my mother exhaled sharply. "We need to talk." I leaned against the marble fireplace, arms crossed. "Then talk." Aunt Julia was the first to break. "This whole thing is insane," she snapped. You know this isn't right. That money, this house, it should have been split among the family, not just handed to you." I arched a brow. "Handed to me? You think I didn't earn it?" Matthew scoffed. "By what? Sitting by his bedside? Running his errands? Don't act like you're some kind of saint. You took advantage of him." I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat, but I didn't let it escape. Instead, I straightened, meeting his gaze head on. "Let me ask you something, Matthew." I tilted my head. "Where were you when he got sick?" His jaw tightened. I turned to my mother. "And you? When was the last time you saw him before the funeral?" Her lips parted, then closed again. I turned to my aunt. "Or how about you, Julia? When was the last time you spoke to him?" Silence. They had nothing. No excuses, no defense, because they all knew the truth. I shook my head. "You don't get to act like I did something wrong just because you were too selfish to care about him while he was still alive." My mother's eyes burned with frustration. "We are his family." I gave a sharp, humorless smile, and yet the only person he trusted in the end was me. My aunt slammed a hand against the table. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was thinking more clearly than he ever had. My voice was like ice now, sharp enough to cut. "And that's why he made sure not a single one of you got a cent." Their fury was palpable, and I relished it. Matthew let out a slow, bitter breath, shaking his head. "So, that's it? You're just gonna sit in this big house alone with all this money knowing you screwed your family over?" I exhaled slowly, then turned, grabbing a thick brown envelope from the table and tossing it onto the polished wood between us. They stared at it, then back at me. "What is this?" my mother asked suspiciously. I smirked. "The final nail in the coffin." Matthew snatched it up, tearing the flap open, and pulled out the documents inside. As his eyes scanned the first page, his face went white. Julia grabbed the papers next, her lips moving silently as she read. Her fingers trembled. Then she slammed them down. "This is bullshit." I just smiled. "You thought you had leverage," I murmured. "You thought maybe you could fight this in court. But that right there?" I nodded toward the papers. "That's my uncle's final letter. He wrote it a month before he passed. In it, he details exactly why he disinherited all of you. Every cruel word, every moment of neglect, every time he reached out and you ignored him, it's all in writing. And that?" I nodded at the second stack of papers. "That's a notarized statement from his lawyer confirming that he was of sound mind when he made his will." Silence. Utter, devastating silence. Then my mother's voice, small now, shaking. He wrote this?" I nodded. Every single word. Their anger was gone now, replaced by something far worse. Shame. They had come here expecting to win, expecting me to cave, to split the money, to let them have a piece of what they never deserved. Instead, they got the truth. Ugly, unavoidable, final. Matthew clenched his jaw, grabbing the papers and shoving them back into the envelope. "This isn't over." I exhaled sharply. "Oh, it really is." And this time, when I pointed toward the door, they didn't argue. One by one they left. I was the one shutting them out, and it felt glorious.